where news comes first. This is ABC-7 Extra.
Welcome to ABC-7 Extra. I'm Andrew J. Polk. I spoke last week with Levi Monagle, attorney with a firm representing some of the pre-sex abuse cases that are a part of the El Paso Diocese bankruptcy. The full interview was too long for our Sunday broadcast, but we do have the complete interview here for you now. Speaking now with Levi Monagle with Huffman and Monagle LLC. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your interest.
So when it comes to what has been happening since the first announcement came from the El Paso Diocese about their Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, what has been happening on your end when it comes with the cases you're handling or, any progression of them?
So in terms of the bankruptcy itself, we're still in the very, very early days. Earlier this week, the bankruptcy judge held some preliminary motions hearings regarding basic motions that the diocese will file to make sure that it can continue to spend money, operate its parishes, all those sorts of things while the bankruptcy unfolds. That's very standard. The judge is going to be in the process of appointing a creditors committee, which is a committee of abuse survivors in a case like this who act in a representative capacity on behalf of all the abuse survivors who may come forward over the length of the case. On our end, our team is primarily just responding to outreach from survivors. Since the bankruptcy was filed last Friday, we've had calls from a number of survivors inquiring about the bankruptcy, asking about their options, and seeking help. And so we've been in lengthy conversations with those folks and intend to help them all as best we can.
So a couple of things affect that to my understanding. Among other things, this being a bankruptcy filing, it puts deadlines on such action like that, whereas, previously there was some states have statute of limitations. My understanding is New Mexico does not have a statute of limitations, so this now imposes a deadline. Is that correct?
Partially. New Mexico has a statute of limitations for claims involving childhood sexual abuse. It's just a more flexible statute of limitations than exists in Texas. The Texas statute of limitations is fairly rigid. The New Mexico statute of limitations is much more flexible. But you're correct that in a bankruptcy setting, the court will establish hard deadlines by which claimants need to come forward and participate in the bankruptcy if they're going to have any chance of bringing claims against the diocese at all. So there is that urgency in a bankruptcy forum that doesn't exist to the same degree in day-to-day civil litigation.
So when it comes to the interest that you've gotten at this point, put that in perspective of us. I understand you represent a number of people that have put these cases forward at this point. How does that compare to the amount of interest that you've had from people saying, I'm in a similar situation and want to explore options, since that announcement was made?
Yeah, I mean, since Friday, I've spoken with probably half a dozen survivors that I've never spoken with before. People who are just sort of reaching out for the first time, um, discussing what they can do, what they should be aware of. And it's hard to say, how many additional survivors may be out there. I think that it takes time. It takes time and sometimes a lot of time for people to process the news around a bankruptcy like this, talk to people in their lives, about what they should do and then decide whether or not they want to come forward. So I expect that, whatever deadline the bankruptcy judge eventually establishes, that there will be a relatively steady flow of calls and outreach from survivors over the course of that period.
When it comes to those that might be in that situation, wondering what their options are, with every case being different, as every person and the interactions are different, what kind of things are you looking for someone to be able to have a case that could successfully move forward, at least in your experience?
That's a good question. I think that um, the first message really is to talk to a professional, right? Like people aren't going to know whether their claims are viable, whether what their options are, unless they talk to someone who understands the bankruptcy process, understands these deadlines, and understands the consequences of not submitting a claim in a timely manner. So, you know, people don't have to commit to participating in the bankruptcy on the basis of a call for information. And, whether that's to our firm or to any of the other, very experienced firms in this space, the important thing is to get that information so that people can make informed decisions about what they want to do based on their, personal feelings, their family situations, all the other factors that go into this for survivors. I think people sometimes don't realize, how tightly confidentiality is protected in a bankruptcy setting, in a clergy abuse bankruptcy setting, and that's been uniform throughout these bankruptcies. So that at least can be sort of a baseline for people, or if they're deciding, whether or not they want to participate in the bankruptcy process.
So, speaking about timelines there, as you mentioned, you're saying that the judge will set some more ones, but in general, from what we've seen so far, it seems like we're on order of magnitude of about half a year from the initial filing of when things kind of need, well, they're expected to be, firm at that point. So, practically speaking, then, for anyone looking to, again, explore their options, what kind of timelines then, with that in mind, are then for actually having something filed ahead of when then the window closes essentially.
Yeah, I think the closer people come forward in relation to these deadlines that are set by the court, the trickier it can be to sort of muster all the necessary information in a timely manner. Um, I think that, but even if people are right up against the deadline, it's far better for them to come forward and get something submitted to the court in advance of the deadline than to assume that, well, it's too late, we won't have time to bring everything together before this deadline runs. Because if you're able to submit a claim even at the last minute, you can at least kind of keep your foot in the door and then supplement that claim down the road as more information is gathered, by attorneys or investigators or anyone else. When my firm was involved in the litigation with the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, that happened. There were a lot of people who were coming forward, very close to the deadline. Um, on the day of the deadline, in fact, and I have vivid memories of handwriting, proofs of claim with people sitting there, trying to collect as much of this information as we possibly could because there wasn't even time to type it. We needed to get it down to the courthouse and submitted before 5 p.m. And so it's, as long as this deadline hasn't run, my message would be that it's not too late, right? That people will move heaven and earth to get something submitted on your behalf before that deadline, and then circle back around to collect additional information and tie it to your claim. So yeah, but obviously, in a best case scenario, survivors can come forward, a little bit in advance of the deadline so that there is time to collect necessary information and documents and submit a strong claim right off the bat.
Let's take a step back for a second, Fu, before the filing. Since your firm represents again a number of people that have, made these cases and were seeking this, what was the communication or the indication known on your end ahead of the diocese making that decision and just kind of the lead up to it?
Yeah, the diocese. I can't get into all the details of it because of rules governing attorneys in this space. I can say that the diocese did not blindside us or our clients with the bankruptcy. There were intimations, in the fall of last year that this was likely to happen, and we appreciated that. It's much worse for survivors to have this just come completely out of the blue and assume that they're going through one process, particularly if they're getting close to jury trials, and then have that door shut, abruptly. um, but it was somewhat up in the air, I think, until you get word that this is actually going to be filed or has in fact been filed. So um, without getting into the exact particulars of those discussions, I can at least say that the diocese didn't spring this, out of the blue on the folks who were involved in litigation and getting close to trials, which is to their credit.
So, while not exactly surprised, like you said, it's always a question of will it until it actually happens. What kind of response have you been receiving from the clients you are representing at this point since that filing has been made?
The response that we've had from the survivors that we represent has essentially been, one of resilience. For them, this is a new chapter of their litigation fight with the Diocese of El Paso. but it's, just the next chapter. It's a continuation. The goals of our clients and the survivors we represent hasn't changed simply because the forum has changed, right? The injuries that our clients suffer as children haven't changed, and their expectations and goals for any sort of negotiated settlement with the diocese haven't changed. It's just that we're going to be having these discussions in a different forum and on behalf of a broader collective of abuse survivors than we would in the context of an individual lawsuit.
Given that you all have been working on this type of subject matter for a while now, and there have been in popular media and in other filings, essentially some rough calculations that have been made of given how these cases and essentially the church itself handled these things in the past, that there might be estimations of how many people were affected or potentially, could still have claims. Is there any estimation or like working theory of number that you all are working with how widespread this could be of the time frame we're talking about?
I I mean, I understand that there are people who make those sorts of estimates based off of data from other bankruptcies, and I don't fault them for it. For my part, I have learned not to speculate in this regard. I mean, I think that we're aware currently of, more than 20 survivors, closer to 30 survivors, who I think could very well end up submitting claims in the bankruptcy. Um, and then there are studies around, reporting or non-reporting of child sexual abuse in particular. So I I would be surprised, frankly, if there were as many claimants in this bankruptcy as there were in like the Archdiocese of Santa Fe bankruptcy, or bankruptcies in, New York, or places where there's just a vastly, greater population. But at the same time, there were a lot of prolific, repeat offenders in the Diocese of El Paso, and in southern New Mexico over a long period of time. And so, and in a culture, whether it's in New Mexico or in West Texas, where you have deeply Catholic, often deeply Hispanic communities, where the culture does not make it easy, to talk about sexual abuse, and no culture makes it easy. But in communities like New Mexico or West Texas, it's, I would say, more difficult still. And so we really just don't know how many survivors there may be out there. The culture of secrecy around all of this, and a culture of secrecy that I think the church promulgated for a very long time, is designed, frankly, to obscure that knowledge, from any kind of outside observation. So we will find out. I mean, I think that the goal is just to make sure people know that this deadline is a make or break deadline, if they're intending to participate in the bankruptcy process.
When it comes to the actual legal actions happening at this point, and you said, previously you've told us that your survivors that you represent were wanting to, have their stories be able to be told in court, and that, as the change of venue, as you mentioned, will now be different, while not asking you to, by any means, speak on the legal theory on behalf of the diocese and not pretending to have the full legal terminology correct on my end. Essentially, what this might have been explained to me as is that the diocese is no longer necessarily contesting these cases, but rather putting forth this is what we have to settle it by seeking the Chapter 11 bankruptcy, so that is how the list progress. Is that more or less accurate?
I mean, the diocese will have the legal option to make objections to claims in the bankruptcy. There are strategic considerations uh, involved in that they'll have to weigh very carefully, because bankruptcy can, particularly a voluntary, Chapter 11 bankruptcy like this, can be a process of good faith negotiation between a debtor and its creditors, or it can be highly contentious, and there can be intense litigation, regarding which properties the diocese owns or doesn't own, which assets it controls or doesn't control. And so there is a strategic decision that'll need to be made by the diocese, as the bankruptcy unfolds. Are we going to try to compensate all of these survivors fairly, or are we going to try to, play them against each other, or target certain subsets of the survivor community for our strategic purposes? I think they understand that, targeting subgroups of these survivors for any particular reason is going to create a more contentious process, and that there are going to be some more contentious demands from whatever creditors committee is ultimately appointed that come back the other way. So it will be up to the diocese, I think, ultimately as to whether claims in this bankruptcy are challenged or not.
When it comes to the statements that Bishop Seitz made and other staff have made, in their release, in the news conference that they held as the filing the day it was made, when it comes to your take on how you receive those statements and what you think that might mean then for the people that you represent and how they might be handling this.
I don't doubt um, Bishop Seitz's sincerity in expressing regret for the abuse that children suffered in the Diocese of El Paso. Um, I also, at the same time, hope to see that regret, that acknowledgement in the media of the harm that these folks have suffered reflected in the conduct of the diocese as the bankruptcy unfolds, right? Like I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but talk is cheap and bankruptcies are expensive. And a lot of harm was done by clergy in the Diocese of El Paso over the past 50 years. Um, if if Bishop Seitz is going to say publicly, that we regret this, we want to treat these folks fairly, then we will have, a process through the bankruptcy that can either reflect that message or undercut it pretty substantially. And so again, it's too early to tell, how the message that Bishop Seitz has expressed publicly will factor into the debates and negotiations on behalf of survivors that happen behind closed doors.
Taking a few steps further back now, I remember seeing myself some advertisements that were around our region that was about if you are someone that experienced this abuse within certain time frames going on for at least the last couple of years, just to my recollection. And to my understanding that your firm was involved in it. In fact, you're in one of the videos at the top of one of these pages that is associated with it. What led you, your firm, to get into doing this and putting forth that kind of both awareness and looking for victims campaign?
Yeah, so the campaign you're talking about is the New Mexico Priest Abuse Project, and we did put together a website that had a lot of information about the Diocese of El Paso, the Diocese of Las Cruces, um, credibly accused clergy in both of those dioceses, and some messages from survivors themselves on that website about what it meant for them to finally get this off their chest, come forward and tell their stories. It was important for us, I think, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, we were coming off of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe bankruptcy, which was a long, drawn out process, contentious at times for sure. And, in the course of that bankruptcy, I had to have a lot of conversations with survivors who missed the deadline, who were not able to bring claims, and who essentially had the door shut on them. That was very difficult. It was very difficult to have those conversations and to explain to people who had mustered finally this courage to tell their story that they could not seek justice through the legal system anymore. Um, we were sitting around talking about it and did not want that to happen again, right? I mean, I live in New Mexico. I don't ever intend to leave New Mexico, but my wife's from El Paso, my law partner's from El Paso, so this is our backyard, like and a community that is very near and dear to us at a personal level. Um, it's in a jurisdiction, where we can help people based on our training as lawyers. It was a decision we made to try to spread the word about this as thoroughly as we could, because we just don't want to be having those conversations with abuse survivors. Um, you know, at the time we're thinking, if the Diocese of El Paso does this, if the Diocese of Las Cruces does this, we don't want it to be a surprise, to the communities. We want to make sure that people have as much time as possible to come forward and tell their stories. And so that was the origin of the New Mexico Priest Abuse Project. And the claims, the claims that were in litigation with the Diocese of El Paso that were proceeding towards trials were the claims of people who reached out to us, through that project. And so if that sort of critical mass of claims that I think that the diocese has talked candidly about, being the cause of its bankruptcy filing, or at least the explanation for the timing of its bankruptcy filing, um, if those claims are the cause, then that's where it started.
So at this point, through the end of the process here, what are your expectations? What are you hoping to see? And what do you want people to know about what this is going to take and ultimately look like?
My hope is that the diocese will commit itself from the early stages of this bankruptcy to document transparency, an abuse documents archive, with survivors' information redacted and protected, but commit itself to telling the internal story of the abuse crisis in the Diocese of El Paso, um, to making public, its knowledge of some of these perpetrators, who many of whom had long careers in the Diocese of El Paso, because I think of that as a function of the church's own penance, essentially. And I know that many of the survivors I represent feel the same way. It is institutional confession. You have to put it out into the open in order to be absolved of it, and withholding it is not going to lead to absolution. Um, that's a major overarching goal, and I hope it's something that the diocese understands, because it's a very important one for the survivors that we've spoken with. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, our clients' expectations, and I don't think the expectations of any survivor should change simply because we're in a new forum. Um, these cases that were in litigation were claims for damages done based on childhood sexual abuse, and those damages were extensive. Um, our clients and survivors broadly should expect, to be made whole, fair compensation through the bankruptcy system, in the absence of jury trials. So those, I think, are the twin goals: um, transparency and accountability from the diocese throughout the process. Um, and as I know I keep alluding to, time will tell as to how willing the diocese and its representatives are to engage with us in good faith on those goals.
One thing we have sometimes heard in feedback when it comes to situations like this, and since the filing, is that what will money do? If someone has had this, how can this heal them? Or that alternately, if this is someone looking to cash in on something that happened years ago, how do you respond to people who have that perspective?
I mean, this is not an argument you can make to a jury under the rules governing lawyers, but people who have that mentality should ask themselves, what they would be willing to endure for, what amount of money. And I think that it pretty quickly becomes clear that very few people would be willing to endure the kinds of abuse that our clients suffered for any amount of money. Um, so, if the diocese could buy our clients a time machine and take them back to their childhoods, and spare them the abuses that they suffered, that would very likely be the demand across the board. Um, the diocese cannot afford or create a time machine, as far as I know. We'll investigate that in discovery, but I think we can safely say that they're not going to have a time machine to offer our clients. And so, in the absence of that, the primary and sometimes only remedy offered to folks in this situation through the legal system is damages compensation. I think at a practical level, fair damages, particularly by a jury of one's peers, is a validation of the suffering that these folks have carried with them for their entire lives. It is an acknowledgement, mediated through numbers, but an acknowledgement at least that can be assessed and compared and thought over of the damage that was done. And to have a jury of one's peers, people from one's own community, acknowledge that the damage that was done here was extensive. It means a lot to people to have told their story, have been believed by the people in their own community whose rejection they feared for so long, and then to have the extent of the damage that was done acknowledged in the form of a verdict. Um, at a practical level, the awards that people receive either through the jury system or through settlements or through a bankruptcy proceeding make a tangible difference on their lives. They alleviate the chronic strains and pressures that sexual abuse survivors constantly labor under. They provide access to therapeutic resources that oftentimes survivors cannot otherwise access, and they just allow people room to breathe. That is the practical effect of damages awards in this context, and we see over and over and over again what a difference it makes for people to just have a little more space and a little more time to focus on healing and unpacking the traumas that they suffered as children, rather than constantly scrambling and trying to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis.
Again, and speaking right now with Levi Monagle with Huffman and Monagle LLC. Thank you very much for telling us about what has been going on and what you will still continue doing with the filings with the bankruptcy of the El Paso Diocese here today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Andrew J. Polk. Stay safe out there. Look twice for motorcycles and out on the road, and have a great week. I'll see you next Sunday night.